On the 15th of June 2001, Tata Engineering reported its results for the financial year. The company had lost 500 crore rupees, 500.34 crore to be exact. The year before, it had made a profit of 71 crore. But every single quarter of that year had been a loss. And the worst of them was the last one, which is another way of saying that when the year ended, the bleeding hadn't stopped. Now, that number is striking on its own, but it becomes genuinely strange when you know what happened 30 months earlier. Because in January 1998, in a packed hall in Delhi, the same company had pulled a white dome of a small hatchback and stopped an entire industry in its tracks. A truck manufacturer had designed a car. In India, for India. The chairman, 60 years old, had to physically push through the crowd afterwards to get to the exit, gasping that he needed air. Before that car reached a single showroom, more than 100,000 people had put money down to buy one. The market leader panicked and cut the price of India's best-selling car in response. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most successful product launch in the history of the Indian automobile industry. And 2 years later, the man who built it was quietly considering whether the entire passenger car business should be sold. So here's the question I want to answer. How does a project succeed at almost everything it was designed to do, and still nearly destroy the company that built it? To understand what happened, you have to understand what India was driving in 1991. The two most common cars on Indian roads were the Hindustan Ambassador and the Premier Padmini. The Ambassador was a licensed British design from the 1950s. The Padmini was a licensed Italian design, also from the 1950s. They were built in India by Indians in Indian factories, but nobody had designed them here. They were, in a very literal sense, borrowed. The one modern car was the Maruti 800, a joint venture between the Indian government and Suzuki, launched in the early 80s. It changed everything. It was small, reliable, efficient, and by the 90s it was so dominant that its price effectively defined what a car cost in India. So the country had a car history. What it didn't have was a car of its own. And this bothered people more than you might expect. By the early 90s, India had launched spacecraft and missiles. It had a space program. It had nuclear physics. What it did not have was a hatchback anyone in the country had drawn. Then, in 1991, two things happened in the same year. First, India liberalized its economy. Decades of licensing restrictions started coming down, and foreign car makers began looking at a market of what would eventually be 1 billion people. The second, a 53-year-old architect by training named Ratan Tata became chairman of the Tata Group. I want you to hold on to one fact about the company he inherited, because it explains almost everything that happens later in the story. Telco, Tata Engineering and Locomotive Company, was a truck manufacturer. Not a car company that also made trucks. It was a truck company. It had been building commercial vehicles since the 50s under an agreement with Daimler-Benz. It was the dominant force in Indian trucking. Its engineers understood chassis, load, torque, durability, and the specific physics of a vehicle that has to survive being overloaded on a bad road for 15 years. It had no background in cars. Remember that. We'll come back to it. In the mid-90s, Ratan Tata stood up in public and described a car that did not exist. He said it would have the exterior size of a Maruti Zen, the interior size of an Ambassador, the price of a Maruti 800, and the running costs of a diesel. Take that apart for a second. because it's the most important sentence in the story. Those four requirements do not naturally coexist. A car with an ambassador's interior is a big car. A car with Zen's footprint is a small one. You are being asked to build something bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And then you are being asked to sell it at the price of a car 2 segments below it, running an engine that was at that time mostly found in taxis and light commercial vehicles. Nobody in India had a car like that because nobody could figure out how to build one profitably. The reaction was skepticism. That's well documented and it's not surprising. A truck company had just announced it would out-engineer the global automotive industry on its first attempt. But I want to be careful here, and this is a good moment to say something about sources. One of the main sources for this episode is a book called Tata Stories, written by Harish Bhatt, who was a senior executive at the Tata Group and one of its brand custodians. Chunks of the same text sit on Tata's own website. It's a genuinely useful document. It contains detail you won't find anywhere else, and it's surprisingly candid about the failures. But it is a company telling its own story. It has a hero and it has a moral. Because on this particular story, they always don't agree. And the differences are the most interesting part. So how do you build a car when you've never built one? The first attempt was the obvious one. Telco's own design team produced prototypes for a small car and presented them to Ratan Tata. He binned them, politely, by the account of Autocar India's editor who covered this era closely. And that decision tells you something important about how he was thinking. He had concluded that styling was not something his organization could do yet, and that pretending otherwise could kill the project. So he went looking for it. He went to Turin. The firm was Idea, a design house that had shaped the Alfa Romeo 155 and the Lancia Delta. Serious people. And they were given a brief that was, from a European perspective, faintly absurd. Make it look modern and international, and also make it big enough inside for an Indian family with luggage and quite often more passengers than there are seatbelts. What came back was the thing that challenged everything. The Indica didn't look like a compromise. It looked like a European hatchback. Well proportioned, contemporary, with a grille that everyone immediately described as smiling. Nothing on Indian roads looked remotely like it. And this matters for what people later claim about this car. The styling was Italian. That's not a criticism. Ratan Tata himself has been completely open about it. In an interview quoted in our source material, describing why he took the challenge on, he talks about having the conviction that engineers who could put a rocket into space could produce a car. And then says that when they took up the challenge, they went out and got expertise wherever it was necessary. That's a more sophisticated claim than we did it all ourselves. And it happens to be true. Because underneath the Italian skin, a large amount of this car really was built from scratch in Pune. The transmission was developed entirely in-house, a capability the company simply did not have before it started. Thousands of individual components were localized, designed and manufactured either by Tata or by Indian suppliers. The engine was derived from a unit Tata already used in its pickups with a shortened stroke. So the honest description of the Indica isn't India's first indigenous car, it's this. The first car designed and developed in India by an Indian company for Indian conditions. That's less patriotic and more impressive. But the design was never the hard part. Money was. Here is the problem. You can draw a beautiful car. To build one, you need a car factory. And a car factory is not a truck factory with different tooling. It's a different discipline entirely. Press lines, paint shops, tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, a completely different relationship with your suppliers. According to Tata's own account, a new manufacturing facility at that time would have cost more than $2 billion. I want to flag that number. It comes from the company's own retelling and I could not verify it independently. see this as their estimate. But even if it is generous, the underlying point holds and the arithmetic is checkable. The total spend on the Indica project came to more than 1700 crore rupees, which at 90s exchange rates is somewhere around $400 million. If a plant alone had cost anything close to 200 billion, this project simply doesn't happen. The numbers don't work, the board doesn't approve it. So they went looking for a factory somewhere else. And they found one in Australia, a disused Nissan plant offered for sale, again by the company's own account, at roughly a fifth of the cost of building new. They bought it, and then Tata engineers dismantled it, not just the equipment, the entire plant. Brick by brick, in the phrase the company uses. They loaded it into ships, carrying it across Indian Ocean and rebuilt it entirely in Pune. The company says the whole operation took 6 months. I can't verify the timeline independently again, and 6 months is a startling claim. But that a disused foreign plant was acquired, dismantled, shipped, and re-erected in Pune is consistent across every account of this project. Stop and appreciate what that is because it is genuinely brilliant. Ratan Tata had a specification that required a low price, a low cost, and the largest single cost in a car project isn't the design. It's the concrete and steel of the factory and the interest on the money you borrowed to build it. By buying a dead plant instead of a new one, he took the biggest number in the business case and cut it by something like 80%. That is a capital allocation decision of the first order, and it's the reason this car existed at all. Hold the thought too, because we are going to come back to it. And it's not going to look quite as clean the second time. January the 15th, 1998, Pragati Maidan, Delhi, the Auto Expo. The Telco Pavilion covered about an acre and it still wasn't big enough. The hall was packed with journalists, government officials, employees and the entire senior leadership of the Indian automotive industry. The managing director of Maruti, Mr. Anand Mahindra, Mr. Rahul Bajaj. There were lights, there was smoke and there was, for reasons lost to history, a Ukrainian ballet troupe. Then the dome came off. The room went, by every account of it, completely silent for a beat, and then erupted. The heavy industries minister called the Tatas the Kohinoor of India. Ratan Tata, visibly emotional, said the path they had chosen had been criticized by people who said it couldn't be done by them. And then, in an act of quiet confidence, they took it to Geneva, painted pink, and it worked there too. Back home, the order book started filling before the car was there to sell. By the time it reached showrooms, around 110,000 people had placed orders. The market launch came on the 30th of December 1998. Starting price about 2,62,000 rupees. Maruti, the dominant incumbent with the best-selling car in the country, responded by cutting the price of the 800 by roughly 30,000 rupees. That's the detail I'd hold on to. Because you don't cut the price of your most profitable product for a car you think is a joke. Maruti had seen the Indica, done the math and decided it was in trouble. Everything about this is a triumph. The design worked, the financing worked, the launch worked, the competition flinched. And it is precisely at this moment, the highest point in the story, the disaster begins. Here is the first thing you need to understand, and it's counterintuitive enough that most retellings of the story skip it entirely. The 110,000 orders were not a blessing, they were the problem. Think about what an order book that size actually means operationally. It means that on day one, a factory that has never built a passenger car in its life has to run flat out. Maximum shifts, maximum line speed, no slack. Now think about how a manufacturing organization actually gets good. It doesn't happen in a design review. It happens on the line, slowly, unit by unit. The first 100 cars teach you something. The first 1000 teach you more. Somebody notices that a bracket goes on crooked if the operator is tired at the end of a shift and the fixture gets redesigned. A supplier's tolerance drifts and somebody catches it before it chips. That accumulated, unglamorous, 1000 tiny corrections process is what quality actually is in a car plant. Economists call it a learning curve, and it has one requirement. You need to be allowed to make your mistakes on a small number of forgiving customers. Tata didn't get that. Tata's first mistakes went out of the gate at full production rate to 110,000 people who had waited months in a country that was watching. So what actually went wrong with the cars? The supplied source lists them, and to its credit, it doesn't hide them. Uneven tire wear, belt noise, defective pulleys. Notice what those are. None of them is a design failure. The car wasn't badly conceived. These are manufacturing component failures like alignment, tolerance, supplier consistency, etc. And they are the exact category of problem that a learning curve fixes over time. And they are also, from a customer's point of view, unforgivable. A belt that squeals is not a safety issue. It's something you hear every single morning in a car you saved for years to buy, in a car you were proud of. Now, the truck company. The most persuasive explanation of why this happened doesn't come from Tata. It comes from Autocar India's assessment, written 20 years later. Their argument is that the root cause wasn't the design and wasn't even the tooling. It was the workforce accustomed to building buses and trucks simply lacked the meticulous disciplined mindset a passenger car demands. And here's the line in that piece that stopped me. They noted it was a culture that troubled the company even then. In 2018, 20 years on. Think about the gap that implies. Tata bought world-class styling in a matter of months, the thing it could not buy, and was still working on 2 decades later, was the manufacturing culture to execute it. I'll add one more possibility here. And I want to be clear that this is my inference rather than a documented finding. That second-hand plant, brilliant financially, was an equipment built for a different car by a different company, reassembled in a different country by engineers who had never commissioned a car line before. It would not be surprising if the decision that made the project affordable also made the quality problems more likely. I can't prove that, but it's worth sitting with because it's the shape of a lot of business decisions. The saving is visible immediately, and the cost shows up 18 months later in somebody else's department. And the complaints escalated, word of mouth turned, and word of mouth in a market that had waited a decade for this car moved fast in both directions. Rival companies began writing premature epitaphs for the Indica. That's almost certainly true, and it's also exactly what you'd expect competitors to do. But the source then attributes the criticism to condensing minds, Western and Indian, taking pot shots at developing nations. And I'm going to set that aside because the defects were real, the customers were Indian, and their complaints were legitimate. That framing is the moment where a corporate account stops being history. Now let's look at what was actually happening to the company. Tata Engineering posted losses in every quarter of the financial year ending March 2001. It had posted losses in 10 of the previous 16 quarters. The full year loss was 500.34 crore rupees against a profit of 71 crore the previous year. Net sales fell nearly 8% to just over 8,000 crore. And now I have to be fair to the company because there's something the celebratory version of this story leaves out and the critical version does too. The Indica was not the main cause of that loss. Read the actual results reporting and the picture is different. Mainline commercial vehicle sales, the trucks, the business that had funded everything, fell nearly 20% that year. There was a sales tax increase on commercial vehicles, diesel prices surged, the economy slowed. The truck business was in a serious cyclical downturn entirely independent of the car. So the honest version is this: the car project did not cause the loss actually, it removed the company's ability to survive one. And that, I think, is the sharpest financial lesson in this entire story. 700 crore rupees of project spend doesn't vanish when sales slow. It sits there as fixed cost, depreciation, interest, a factory that has to run whether there are buyers or not. At inception, the Indica needed to sell somewhere around 70,000 units a year just to break even on cash. Ratan Tata had been brilliant about the size of the bet. He made it a fifth as expensive as it should have been. What nobody appears to have priced was the correlation. The fact that the new business and the old business were exposed to exactly the same Indian economic cycle. So when the cycle turned, both engines failed in the same quarter. That's not diversification. That's the same bet twice. Which brings us to the decision at the center of the story. By 1999 and into 2000, here is what Ratan Tata was looking at. A car that had been publicly celebrated as a national achievement, now generating customer complaints. A truck business in free fall. A balance sheet absorbing a project that had cost more than 1700 crore. And a personal association with the whole thing so complete that the car was, in the public mind, simply his. And according to Autocar India, whose editor covered this period directly, during this low point, Ratan Tata considered hiving off the passenger car division altogether. Sit with that. The man who announced the impossible specification, who rejected his own team's designs, who personally signed off every styling change, was weighing whether to sell the business he'd created. That is not the corporate retelling. The corporate retelling says there was great resilience, underlying hope, and a strong commitment within the team, which may have well been true on the shop floor, but it is not the whole picture at the top. Now, if you've spent any time on the Indian internet, you already think you know what happened next. The story goes like this. In 1999, Ratan Tata flew to Detroit to sell the passenger car business to Ford. In the meeting, Bill Ford supposedly told him that Ford would only consider buying the division as a favor and asked why Tata had entered the car business when they knew nothing about it. Tata, humiliated, flew back home, resolved to make the business succeed, and 9 years later, bought Jaguar and Land Rover from a struggling Ford. It is a wonderful story. It's been retold in newspapers, in books, in 1,000 LinkedIn posts, and at more than one management conference. There is very little evidence that it happened. After Ratan Tata's death in 2024, Bill Ford issued a statement. He described meeting Tata once in a warm and cordial conversation about the challenges and joys of running family businesses and a mutual love for cars. He said directly that the accounts of their meetings in some press reports could not be further from the truth. And separately, this is the detail that convinces me. The editor of Autocar India has said he asked Ratan Tata about the story a few months before he died. Tata's own account was that it was a pleasant conversation. They talked about baseball and basketball and several other things. Ford's spokesperson later noted that the condensation narrative has always rested on individual impressions rather than credible evidence, and that since Tata himself never publicly commented on it, Ford chose not to either. So why does this myth survive? Because it's emotionally complete. It gives the story a villain, a motive, and a revenge arc that pays off precisely 9 years later. It converts a messy commercial decision into a clean moral one. And here's the thing, the truth underneath it is more interesting, not less. Because the humiliation is fiction, but the near exit is real. Ratan Tata genuinely did consider selling the car business, not because someone insulted him, not because the number was bad and the strategic case for staying was genuinely unclear. That's a harder story. There's no one to be angry at. There's just a man looking at a spreadsheet and a factory and a country's expectations and having to decide. So let's take that decision seriously, the way he would have had to. Selling was rational, genuinely rational. It would have removed a loss-making business at the worst point in the truck cycle. It would have let Tata Engineering concentrate capital on the commercial vehicle franchise it actually dominated. And a buyer would have been getting a modern platform, a new plant, and access to a market every global car maker wanted. This was not a fire sale of garbage. It was a defensible portfolio decision. Staying meant funding an overhaul while losing money in every quarter in a business you had proven you were not yet good at against competitors with 50 years more experience. He stayed. And the argument for staying, the one that has to be doing the work here, is that the asset was not the car. The asset was the platform, the engineering capability, and the several hundred component suppliers who had learned to make car parts to car tolerances. Sell the division and all of that leaves with it. Permanently. India goes back to assembling other people's design. Whether that reasoning was fully formed at the time, or whether it's a rationalization applied afterwards to a decision made on conviction, I honestly don't know. The record isn't clear. But hold on to the word platform. It matters later. What followed was not a marketing exercise, it was an operational overhaul. Manufacturing processes rebuilt, quality control tightened so defects were caught before they reached the customer and design flaws were corrected. In February 2001, the result launched as the Indica V2. The tagline, more car per car, and it worked immediately. The unit economics tell the story better than the adjectives. The cash break-even on the project, originally around 70,000 units a year, was pulled down to about 53,000 through cost rationalization. The net break-even came down from 90,000 to 80. And in the financial year 2001 to 2, the company achieved cash break-even on the Indica project, selling more than 64,000 of them. That's what a turnaround actually looks like, not a slogan. A break-even point moving 17,000 units to the left. The supplied source tells the V2 was ready with all the key quality problems addressed and completely eliminated. I'd push back gently on that. Autocar India's retrospective describes the post V2 Indica as still crude, still rough around the edges, with niggling faults that buyers forgave because the value proposition was so strong. Big, cheap to buy, cheap to run, cheap to repair, and for years, the only diesel in its class. They described quality at Tata was a moving target for a long time afterwards. Both things are true. The V2 fixed the severe reliability failures and rescued the product. It did not turn Tata into a quality benchmark. And that distinction is about to become extremely important because the company was about to find out what the rest of the world thought of the car India was proud of. In 2003, the Indica went to Britain. The partner was MG Rover, the last remnant of the British motor industry. The company descended from the people who built the original Mini. They were dying and they knew it. They hadn't had a small car since the Rover 100 was withdrawn in 1998 after a catastrophic crash safety rating, and they had no money to develop one. So they did a deal with Tata. The Indica would be modified for European tastes, fitted with a Peugeot-derived petrol engine badged as a Rover, and sold in the UK as the CityRover. For Tata, this was enormous. India's own car wearing a British badge on British roads. The first Indian car to carry an international mark. It went badly mostly because of a decision Tata did not make. MG Rover priced it. The entry model was launched at 6,495 pounds. The top version was 8,895. To put that in context, At that price, the CityRover was competing directly against the mid-range Volkswagen Polo and against the Skoda Fabia and the Ford Fiesta. Cars developed on budgets the Indica project never had by companies that had been making passenger cars for 80 years. The British motoring press was merciless. Poor refinement, poor ride, cheap interior materials, high emissions, and above all, a price that made no sense. And then the moment that finished it. Rover refused to lend the car to Top Gear. So James May went to a dealership undercover with a hidden camera, test drove one, and told several million viewers it was the worst car I have ever driven on this program. In December 2004, the prices were cut by £900, which is a company publicly conceding it had got the pricing wrong. And in April 2005, MG Rover collapsed into administration and the CityRover died with it. A shipment of revised cars that was already at sea had to be disposed of by the receivers. Total sales across its entire life around 8,600. Now I want to ask the uncomfortable question that raises because most Indian retellings of the Indica story leave the CityRover out entirely. Was the Indica ever actually world class? And I think the honest answer is it depends entirely on what you're comparing it to. And that's not a dodge, it's the whole insight. In India, at 2.5 lakh rupees, the Indica was extraordinary. More interior space than anything near its price. The only diesel in its class for years. Cheap to run, cheap to fix, and it looked something like from Europe. On value per rupee, it was close to unbeatable, which is exactly why it sold for 20 years. In Britain, at £8,000 against a Polo, it was not competitive. Not because Indian engineers were worse, because it had been designed against a completely different constraint. You cannot build a car to a Maruti 800 price point and then expect it to compete on refinement with cars designed to a European price point. And the fault for pretending otherwise lies with whoever set the price, not with whoever built it. But the reputational damage didn't respect that decision. Tata built it, Tata wore it. And after that, the Indica story becomes something quieter and in some ways sadder. The next generation, the Vista, launched at the 2008 Auto Expo, was completely overshadowed at its own show by another Tata car, the Nano. It kept the Indica name, which made buyers assume it was a facelift rather than an all-new car on a new platform. It never repeated the original's success. Meanwhile, the competition had learned a lesson. Space and affordability, the Indica's entire proposition, was not a patent. Everyone copied it and executed it with better quality control. The numbers tell the rest. By 2016, Tata Motors' share of the Indian passenger vehicle market had fallen to about 4.6%, down by more than half from 2010. 4 years later, in 2020, it had crawled to 4.8. And the Indica itself? It stayed on sale for 20 years, long past the point where anyone could call it current. By the end, it was selling double-digit numbers per month. Dozens of cars, not thousands, surviving in the hinterland as a cheap taxi. In May 2018, Tata quietly discontinued it. The car that had stopped an industry in 1998 ended its life as a budget cab. So let's step outside the story now and ask what this case actually teaches us. I'd argue there are 3 mechanisms doing the work, and the first one is the big one. Some capabilities can be bought, some can only be accumulated, and organizations routinely confuse the two. Ratan Tata correctly identified that telco could not style a car and went to Turin to solve it. Weeks of negotiation, months of work, problem closed. Design was a purchasable capability. What he couldn't buy, what nobody can buy, was the manufacturing culture that turns a good design into a car that doesn't rattle. That is thousands of tiny disciplines distributed across an entire workforce and an entire supplier base. It is built by repetition over years with feedback. And here's the truck payoff. Telco already had that culture. It had spent 40 years developing it, but for trucks. Vehicles sold to fleet operators who expect to maintain them, who care about load capacity and cost per kilometer, and not at all about whether the trim squeaks. That's the real capability. It just wasn't the right one. And an existing strong culture can be harder to change than no culture at all because everyone in the building already believes they know how to build vehicles. Autocar was still describing that gap in 2018, 20 years. That's the actual time scale on which manufacturing culture changes. The second mechanism is financial, and it's the one I'd want any operator listening to take away. Frugal capital allocation reduces the size of a bet. It does not reduce its correlation with the rest of your business. The Australian factory was a genuinely brilliant piece of capital allocation, but the 1700 crore that remained was fixed cost, funded by a truck business that shared every macro driver with the new car business. The same economy, same fuel prices, the same tax regime. When the downturn came, it came for both at once. The lesson isn't don't spend money. It's that when you evaluate a diversification, the question isn't only how much does this cost. It's what has to go wrong for this to hurt at the same time as everything else. The third mechanism is about brands, and it explains something otherwise puzzling about the ending. Brand equity behaves like a stock, not a flow. The Indica accumulated an extraordinary amount of it between 1995 and 1998. A decade of anticipation, national pride, the Auto Expo, 110,000 orders. And it spent almost all of it in about 18 months of squealing bells. After that, better products couldn't fully rebuild it. The name itself had become a signal of value and of compromise. Which is why, when Tata finally did turn its car business around, it didn't want to do it with a better Indica. It did it with new names. Because there is one more thing that happened, and it's the reason this story isn't a tragedy. Remember the platform? The reason, or at least the best available reason for not selling the division in 1999? The Indica architecture didn't die with the Indica. It was re-engineered twice. One evolution became the X1 platform, which underneath everything eventually produced the Nexon. Another was a comprehensive re-engineering of the original small car platform, which produced the Tiago in 2016 and the Tigor in 2017. Those cars did what the Indica never quite managed. They combined the space and value proposition with quality good enough to stop being the story. Tata's market share went from 4.6% in 2016 to about 8% by the 2021 financial year and to roughly 14% by early 2024. Third largest car maker in India and the dominant player in its electric vehicle market. Across the whole family, the platform lineage has found more than 2 million owners. So here's the reframe I want to leave you with. The Indica was never really a story about a car that succeeded or a car that failed. It did both, repeatedly, for 20 years. It's a story about a company buying a capability it did not yet possess and then spending 2 decades learning how to use it. The 1700 crore didn't buy a hatchback, it bought an engineering organization, a supplier base, a platform, and the institutional experience of being bad at something in public and continuing anyway. That asset paid out 17 years late to a management team that had almost nothing to do with the original decision. Which gives us 4 things worth carrying out of this. 1. Before you enter a new business, sort the capabilities you are missing into 2 piles. The ones that you can buy and the ones that you can accumulate. The second pile is where the money is lost. and it's almost always underestimated because it's invisible on a slide. 2. Overwhelming demand at launch can be a liability. The organizations that survive first generation products are usually the ones that got to make their mistakes at low volume, on a small market, on a small number of forgiving customers. 3. Reputation depletes faster than it rebuilds. Tata's recovery required new nameplates, not a better Indica, because sometimes the cheapest route back is a new name rather than a fixed product. And 4. The uncomfortable one, holding a loss-making business for 15 years, produced the platform that saved the company. The same behavior in a slightly different market is the textbook definition of throwing good money after bad. So when you look at Ratan Tata's decision not to sell in 1999, don't ask whether it worked. Ask what he knew that made holding rational at that time. Because the answer to that question is the difference between conviction and stubbornness. And from the inside, on the day you have to decide, they feel exactly the same.